It's sort of like the cops coming to a meth house and somebody opened the door and it's like, oh, how dare you trespass on my property here in our meth house?
What are you doing here?
What are you
Spying,
doing?
no doubt.
Unbelievable.
Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Before you can say rocks and blocks, here we are, Michael. We're back.
We are back. And it's all about goblins this week.
It is all about goblins. And what about these rocks and blocks and tinders and flints and things like that he throws? We'll talk about that.
Tolkien was loving his alliteration.
He was. And, well, there's rhyming there. There's no alliteration, actually, in those two phrases. But, yeah, we'll talk about that. That's actually, I have a big comment about the alliteration that we're going to talk about.
There is alliteration. Alliteration is not just from the first few letters. It's
initial versus internal. You're right. Yes.
Yep.
I was thinking of
Tolkien is a great fan of using both.
Right, and I was thinking of the Old English half-line, which really uses initial alliteration and not internal alliteration in order to define it. And
which is the one people are more familiar with.
Yes, right. All right, so guys, this week, second half, or two-thirds of chapter 4, Overhill and Underhill. And next week is kind of exciting. We're going to be getting into Riddles in the Dark.
Probably the most famous part of Tolkien's work, of all of his works, aside from maybe the ring itself.
No, it's the most famous. It is. The first time you meet Gollum, everything. It's sort of the inflection point of the entire story. It's the inflection point when the Lord of the Rings actually started happening. Before this, there was no ring. Before this, there was no Gollum. There was no greater story that was weaving its way into Middle-earth. Out of this, you could say Sauron came about. Out of this, Mordor came about. All that sort of stuff that we know now was born in next week's episode. Sorry, I'm like pumping up next week's episode. We haven't even gotten to this week's.
Yeah, this week is still okay. I've got a lot of questions about how magic works and what Gandalf's about.
Yeah, it's still good. And sadly, again, Tolkien didn't rewrite this chapter in his 1960 attempted rewrite of The Hobbit. However, in our extended episode, where we will talk about what maybe he would have changed had he continued to rewrite the story. We're going to do that, I think, every week because it's kind of an interesting approach. And a lot of, we had some comments on YouTube where people were like, man, it sounds like you guys dislike The Hobbit. Like, no, I don't dislike The Hobbit. We're simply comparing it to what we know of The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And
exactly.
Yeah, there's no dislike. It's simply, there are times where I'm like, yeah, man, I wish he would have rewritten it. It doesn't mean that we dislike The Hobbit in the same way that I dislike The Sword of Shannara, for instance. So
because it's a takeoff of such a deliberate ripoff of Tolkien.
It's a horrible carbon copy. So we're going to get into that in our extended podcast. We're going to talk about what he would have done, and we're also going to talk about some of the comments. We had an extended chat last week about the differences between goblins and orcs in our extended podcast, where there really are no differences according to Tolkien. He simply used it as a word adjustment. Orc became more like he used the goblin, I think, once, we say, in The Lord of the Rings, and then orc twice in The Hobbit. Yeah. So if you want to get that, we'll get some comments from our members on Discord, which you can get to by going to theonering.com/member. $4 a month. First month is free. Thanks, guys, for supporting. And if you don't join there, just give us a thumbs up and send us a comment about, what do you think Tolkien would have changed in this chapter if he had rewritten it too? So jump on that. And theonering.com/Patreon will also get you a Patreon account if you'd rather do that, and it's a little bit easier for you. But that's $5 a month. Sorry, everybody.
Not sorry.
All right.
Oh, not sorry.
Not sorry. I have no choice there. All right. Hey,
gotta pay the bills.
Yeah. Hey. So this week we have a brief but good Hobbit.
Hobbit facts.
Facts. I split up the words. That was bad. I'm still learning this, guys. Did you know in The Hobbit? I guess you could call this two Hobbit facts, which is fine this week. They're really related. There is not one female character in The Hobbit. There's no female character.
Oh, you're right.
At all in The Hobbit.
Huh.
Which is interesting.
No good females, no bad females.
And there's only one woman mentioned by name in The Hobbit.
Mother of Bilbo?
Wow. Belladonna Took, you're right. Look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, impressive. She's the only female name mentioned in The Hobbit, and that's why the book is so good. No, I'm joking.
Canceled.
No, I never thought about that. There are no female characters in The Hobbit, just like Little Women has no male characters.
Not quite true.
But there you go. That's your Hobbit fact this week. Nice and brief. Okay, so this week, Michael, I thought we do something a little bit new this week and actually start with a recap of this chapter rather than doing it in the middle of it. So do you want to jump into that and like kind of give us a quick recap? I'll tell you, people, where we're starting is when the crack in the back of the cave opens and Bilbo has awoken from his dream.
Yep. So you want me? Would you like me to do a recap of what we're covering today, or the whole chapter?
Yes. Well, what we're covering today, and you can say how we got here. But
so,
what we're covering.
So this is we ended with Bilbo's dream, and it turns out he had I won't even call it prophetic dream, a clairvoyant dream, because he's dreaming what's actually happening. Mm-hmm. So he's actually dreaming about this crack opening and
a waking dream, maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's right. A waking dream. That kind of thing. It's very interesting. I've heard that there's some good analyses of all the uses of dreams in Tolkien, and I would love to actually read something on that because it's clear that Tolkien had a special place for dreams in his work. But in any case, we start this part of our podcast with the waking up of Bilbo, and he wakes up with a shriek. And it's too late for the ponies. The goblins have come out of a fissure, which opens and closes, which is an odd, interesting. I have something to say about that. But so the chapter goes forward from the capture of the dwarves and Bilbo by the goblins, who then take them down. And seen as how Tolkien never, ever lets a chapter go to waste without a song. We indeed have a song from the goblins, though. And so they are captured, they're dragged in chains, driven by whips and dragged in chains before the Great Goblin, the king, Great Goblin king under the mountain. And the Great Goblin confronts them in a somewhat rather funny fashion, like a 19th century British villain. And then but the sight of Biter, or Orcrist, the sword that they got, the goblins call it Biter, drives him into a rage. He's basically about to kill them, and Gandalf comes back to save them. Gandalf saves them, frees them. They flee through the mountains. They're pursued by goblins. There's an encounter again with the goblins, a martial encounter. They flee some more, and the chapter ends with the goblins reaching them a second time, and Bilbo being pulled off of Dory and onto the floor and hitting his head and knocking himself out, which is, it turns out, a plot point I just last night read to my kids on round 21 of The Lord of the Rings at the Grumbine house, or in the life of Michael Grumbine anyway. The 8th time I've read Lord of the Rings to my kids. They're the Black Gate, at the Black Gate, and Pippin follows suit by getting knocked out by having a troll fall on him. So Hobbits getting knocked out is a transition point for Tolkien. That's how you work. Bilbo it's going to happen to Bilbo again at the Battle of the Five Armies. Right. It happens in Riddles in the Dark. It happens. It probably happens at least one other time that I'm not thinking about, but then it happens to Pippin at the Black Gate. So anyway, this is one of Tolkien's literary transitions, and so that is the end of the chapter. And then, as you mentioned, the next chapter is Riddles in the Dark, which will be next week.
So the crack opens. We talked last week about the crack and how perhaps it was the dwarves who made that, and the dwarves made all the back doors. And again, this is just speculation. For Tolkien, he needed an opening for that. And honestly, I would say that the orcs, he does mention that they are crafters as well, or they're clever. They just make nothing beautiful. And so the orcs certainly, I think, could have built this the door to their back porch. So it is their back porch, right? They call it their porch later.
Yeah, they call it their front porch, I think, right?
Yeah, front porch. And so they're taken, and
all of them except Gandalf.
All of them except Gandalf. So Gandalf, he kills a few of them. I love like how in these stories, the bad guys die. Like in modern stories, it takes a while for anybody to get injured, and there's never any real danger for either the good guys or the bad guys in a lot of modern, especially movie stories for kids. But here we've got the trolls. They're gone, and then we have a number of them that just fell flat to the ground dead. They fell dead.
Yep. Here's a funny thing. Do you think Gandalf is doing pyrotechnics or magic? Here's why. Bilbo's yell. It says, but not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up wide in a splintered second, which I love. Instead of a split second, it's a splintered
second. Yeah.
And when the goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, and a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. We know that Gandalf does fireworks.
Yeah.
If it was lightning that he used, it would smell like ozone, not like gunpowder. Gunpowder and ozone are different.
Yeah.
Very different smells. And so are we talking like, or maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe Gandalf has some gunpowder and he ignites it with magic or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's fascinating. He's about to do something similar or somewhat similar a little later on. But what do you think is why would Tolkien compare it to gunpowder?
Yeah, I think I was always of the opinion that it was both. It was he's sort of like he's got James Bond, but he's like Wizard James Bond because he's got gadgets and gizmos that he can use, but only he can really use them well. And so this here, it's like a flashbang, but a wizard flashbang that.
Right. So he's igniting something damage. Physical, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. Well, if there's a smell of gunpowder.
Yeah. Seems like there's probably gunpowder.
There's probably gunpowder. Yeah.
It's a pretty, saltpeter is a very significant smell, as they used to call it.
Yeah.
And we have, to remember forward, we have the example of him lighting, he doesn't throw fireballs, he ignites pine cones and throws them at the dwarves.
Yeah, that's right. He has to use something.
So he uses something real, but he has the power to ignite with his magic. Mm-hmm, so he ignites. This case probably has a packet of gunpowder, or I don't know, who knows, but some flashbang of some type, but enough to kill a bunch of them. It isn't just like boom.
It's not just like you
lost your fingers or something.
It's not like Bilbo disappearing in a flash like he does in the books. In the beginning of that, right? Like where it's not just a visual device; it's actually something that's an offensive device, right? To kill
it's an actual explosion. It kills some goblins. So that's interesting. Anyway, so you were saying.
Let me ask you then. I want to ask you about the phrases that he used, because he says a couple of interesting things that I thought were almost out of place. It felt like. He says, "Out jumped the goblins, big goblins, great goblins," because before you could say rocks and blocks. And then a sentence later, he says, they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint. Two interesting phrases. And so I was like, oh, well, those have got to mean something, right? So I spent a little time researching that. Nope, they don't. There's nothing. There's rocks and blocks. There's nothing there. But here's the cool thing about that.
Like tinder and flint has a purpose.
Tinder and flint, but there's no colloquial saying that we would identify with tinder and flint like rocks.
Oh,
and
right.
blocks.
No, right? I see it as him just doing like one sentence in advance foreshadowing. Tinder and flint is foreshadowing the explosion Gandalf's going to make. With like he ignites something like gunpowder, which you're going to need tinder and flint for. And so I see it as rocks and blocks. We've just referenced this growing crack in the cave that everyone's being dragged through. And so you got the rocks and blocks there. Is where the goblins are coming through the rock. And if you're right, it's a dwarf door, then there's probably blocks of stone. It's probably not a magical crack that's opening up and closing. So and then the tinder and flint.
So they're italicized.
Yep, that's true.
Which is interesting. And italicized is it's also like putting it in quotes. It's like this is a saying. So I feel like he's trying to say this is a saying that people use. And here's the thing. This is the point I want to make, is that this is how Tolkien creates a world. Is like he does this one little phrase, tinder and flint and rocks and blocks. And rocks and blocks, even more so than that. You feel like, oh, that means something like before you, it'd be an exclamation when somebody stubs his toe, rocks and blocks, right? And before you could say that, before you had a chance to exclaim, all this stuff happened. And so I really like how just that little phrase helps create the world that his characters are inhabiting better without explaining, okay, so now here's what rocks and blocks mean. Before he could say rocks and blocks, because rocks fell from the mountainside and the blocks are used to build the goblin city below. He doesn't have to do that explanation. He just has to say rocks and blocks and he creates the world. A little expert move of an expert writer. So
yeah, it's so clean and succinct where it just it's enough to give your imagination that little boost to build something where you don't have to. He doesn't have to prevaricate.
It's like real subcreation, but it's like he's giving us a little bit of direction to go into with it without just explaining it all like modern writers try to do.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it.
Although he does then later say the goblins knew their way as well as you do to the nearest post office, which took me right.
Yeah, that was funny. I was going to bring that up too. So it's still and there's it. We're going to talk about this more, but let me just say this chapter is quite different from the next chapter, Riddles in the Dark. Just like we've been talking about the transition in the previous chapter, he's making the transition to Middle Earth versus this. He still has he's telling a story from Bilbo's perspective of what's happened. And it's still like a casual conversation, like Bilbo telling a story to Hobbit children or something like that. But then next chapter, it's going to be full on dialogue. Like it's the most dialogue heavy thing we've run into. We had a foretaste in chapter 1, but extremely heavy on the dialogue. And so he's still perfectly fine. He did not cut out the post office reference, just like the whistle of the train in the previous one. Chapter. And a few others. And he just doesn't cut them out.
Although I guess you could say the hobbits do have a post office in the Lord of the Rings. So
they do.
It's not out of this world.
They do, but that's presuming that we understand that hobbits have post offices. I think he's referring to the post office that like and having lived in England, like this is what you do. You walk to the post office all the time. For many things.
Yeah.
And everyone knows where their post office is. So it's interesting. So he immediately begins painting a picture of what goblins are like. The goblins were very rough and pinched unmercifully and chuckled and laughed in horrible stony voices. And Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for his nice bright hobbit hole. Not for the last time. Look, it's Tolkien's commentary. Yeah.
He's like,
we're going to be here again in the future.
Yeah. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, and then so the goblins began to sing and croak and keep time with the flap of their flat feet on the stone and to shake their prisoners. And their song that they sing is full of what's the not glottals? What's the name of the
onomatopoeia?
The consonant sound, which is very harsh and closed. Clap, snap, black, crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab. It's the in sounds.
I mean, it's a hard consonant.
They're hard consonants. There's a name.
Harsh, hard. I'm trying to say. I don't know. This
is a professional operation, folks. We look up our stuff.
Well, I'm not a philologist or
neither am I.
A grammarian.
Yeah. So, but what I'm trying to say is even the way they sound has its own feel to it, just like the way elves sound has their own feel to it in Lord of the Rings, and the way dwarves sound in the dwarven, the few dwarven words that we get in Lord of the Rings as well. He's starting to give a feel, and goblins. They almost remind me of the 1980s movie Gremlins. They're almost like they're not just about they're not just animals that are about feeding things. They have their own kind of culture, and they delight in the pain of others. Other goblins, other creatures of any sort. They cackle and laugh a lot. They make horrible jokes where basically it's joking about other people undergoing suffering, and they had so he kind of is giving them their character. But I do feel like this character is the character of the goblins from. I know Tolkien had a up and down relationship with George MacDonald over his life, but it feels more like the goblins of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
They have kind of that feel to it, and less of the orcs feel. The orcs seem like a development of this. This is almost like goblins out of a fairy story directly. So
they're not. Yeah, they're not. They're not the orcs that we know from the Silmarillion in particular, like the orcs that slew and chained up Turin, before when he was taken from the wild men after all that. So they're not. These are not the same characters. Those are evil, villainous, sinister slaves to Morgoth. These are more like gremlins, like you said.
Yep.
Although the song, I did a lot of, I read the song in much more detail this time.
Nice.
And so I want, like, there are a few things that stood out to me. One is, like you said earlier, there is a lot of alliteration in this, and it carries through. And so, and even later, I'll have another point that I want to make about that. But yeah, the clap, snap, grip, grab, pinch, nab, down to Goblin Town you go, my lad. Crash, crash, crush, smash. And the song is kind of divided into three parts. So the first part is sort of, it's recounting what they're doing. We're taking you down to Goblin Town, and immediately they say, my lad, which then they use later again, my lad, because they're like, nope, you're our slaves. You're the ones that are going to, we're going to take you down to Goblin Town, and where you are going to be whipped, battered, and beaten, where you will yammer and bleat, they say later, where you will work and not dare to shirk, while we drink and laugh, essentially, watching you. And in the second one, they talk about hammers and tongs, knockers and gongs, pound, pound, far underground. That's what they do, right? Because Tolkien does say to them, in this, say about them in the next chapter, or in the next couple paragraphs, where he talks about how they were clever. They made things. They were not just destroyers, but they made the evil things of the world, the things that destroy many people.
Right. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves when they take the trouble, though they're usually untidy and dirty. So they make hammers and axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture. They make these very well, or they get other people to make to their design. Prisoners as slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. Yeah. And so I love what he does. He sets them up in the song. So, and a lot of us will just read over the song and not hear it, but he sets up what's going to happen to the dwarves in the song, who the orcs are in the song, and what the orcs just did in reverse fashion. So that was interesting. The other interesting thing is, when you think about it, the three races that are introduced in this book that are not hobbits are introduced essentially by song. You have the dwarves. They come. What's the very first thing the dwarves do when they all get together? They sing the song. They sing the song in the kitchen, and then they also sing Song of the Lonely Mountain, right? In front with Bilbo there, when they're explaining what they're doing. And then when they first time they meet the elves, it's like the inverse of this song. The elves are the elves are gay and happy and sort of teasing them. And there's a little bit of what's the word? Not malicious. They are. I don't know what the right word is, but the elves always they're a little dangerous. There's a little bit of a tinge of danger to the elves there, and it's a little different. So the elf song, they say a lot of ha ha tralali, right? Here it's ho ho my lad, and so there's even a different tone to how they laugh. So it's both sort of this. They're poking at the dwarves. One is with a little bit of too eager fun, and one is with a malicious intent. And so they introduce the two. He introduces the two different races through a song, which is a very Tolkien thing to do. And the songs are almost a little bit inverses, antonyms of each other, and how they're set up. That's a really good observation. Yeah, and I hadn't thought of the fact that the first time we meet each of the races, they have a song. That's pretty. I never noticed that. Like the dwarves, Misty Mountain song. I'm sorry, not the Misty Mountain song. The song of Erebor, and the.
Sorry, did I say Misty Mountains? Or I did. Yeah, Erebor.
No, I did just there. And then the elves, and the first time we meet them, they have a song. The goblins have a song. I don't know if that there's a song for the spiders, but it's not the spiders' song. It's Bilbo's song.
It's Bilbo's. The men don't have songs.
The men don't have songs. That's right. eagles don't. I don't think Bjorn does. But anyway, he's a man of sorts. But the three first, the trolls don't have a song.
No,
but definitely the dwarves, the elves, and the goblins have their own song.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're supposed to learn about them.
Yeah. Anyway,
Very interesting. Also, I like their attitude. It's not just, again, it's not just I don't like it. I can't like it. It says now goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. So far be it from me to like such things. But their first dialogue they have with the Great Goblin, the king, starts with one of the goblin drivers who's been driving them. Who are these miserable persons? Said the Great Goblin. Dwarves, and this, said one of the drivers, pulling at Bilbo's chain so he fell forward on his knees. We found them sheltering in our front porch. Okay, I don't know what definition of the world, like they consider this a porch. I mean, I understand it's the entrance to their home in one sense. But the fact that they take on such colloquial terms that they'll call it a porch is Tolkien giving them a kind of like English character to their badness. And then he says, the Great Goblin says, what do you mean by it? Said the Great Goblin, turning to Thorin. Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say? This is the presumption of this is that the goblins are there minding their own business and other people would be spying on their quote unquote private business and want to steal their things. As if, it's sort of their land and what are you doing coming into our land, which literally it is, but the fact that they think about it that way, again, you get the English spin on it, a bad-hearted English spin, but nevertheless, this sort of idea that they're really just sort of concerned with their own business and other people come onto their porch and I'll bet you they were here to steal stuff from us or spy on us. And as opposed to, this sort of opportunist villain mentality, which is just, of course, these are dwarves, let's kill them. It's nothing. It's not like that. It's kind of cuter than that almost.
Yeah. It's sort of like the cops coming to a meth house and somebody opened the door and it's like, oh, how dare you trespass on my property here in our meth house?
What are you doing here?
What are you doing?
Spying, no doubt.
Unbelievable. You're the bad guys. You trespasser, you destroyer of my things. It's no.
So Thorin tries to dodge, but the problem is, of course, that one of them pulls up his sword. Orcrist, which it tells. It says, the Great Goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to stop there for a second. That means that stories have been told over
generations,
thousands of years.
Right. Because we're approaching 3,000 years in the Third Age.
Right.
There were 2,000 years in the Second Age, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, more than two. Yeah, over
500. I can't remember.
Yeah. And so we're closing in right now on 6,000 or 5,000 years rather. Yeah, no,
yeah,
6.
Yeah, end of Gondolin, 6,000 years. Yeah.
And so for 5,000 to 6,000 years, goblins have apparently been describing this and
3,500, not 2,500 in the Second Age, just so we know. 3,500.
35 in the Second Age.
So we're about 7,000 years.
Yeah.
Total.
Okay. Yeah. So for longer than from us through the Egyptian dynasties, goblins have been telling them giving an account of these swords to their people. This is what's so funny is that, and obviously I think what this is an accident of the fact that Tolkien wanted these to be, I mean, it's funny because he says specifically the goblins have no particular enmity with the dwarves, although they hate Thorin's people because of the previous, the bad neighbor relations in the Misty Mountains with Thorin's people. But they very particularly do not like elves. Elves are definitely arch enemies of the goblins, here. And the fact that they remember these swords from thousands of years before is kind of funny. And because they see Orcrist, and they clash their shields and stamp, again reminiscent of their song. Like they go into this sort of rhythmic clashing and stamping thing, which is a goblin, the precursor to a goblin song. They had called it Orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins call it simply biter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone that carried it. Murderers and elf friends, the great goblin shouted. Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes, and never let them see the light again. He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat, and he and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. So he's like got to bite it to death, I guess.
Right? Like, yeah. And it's my thought about this here is that Tolkien spends more time talking about the history of the swords than of the characters.
Yeah,
but these swords to him, he had actually, the Fall of Gondolin was his first great tale of Middle Earth that he wrote at the end of World War One. And so I think that when he can bring up the swords and he can use them in the story, I think he loves it. And so I think that's where you get this, the history of the sword. We don't know what the Great Goblin has done. We don't know what his role in any battle was. We don't know what the relationship, but we know that this sword was from Gondolin, was the king's sword, and it had killed, did you say thousands, hundreds of orcs? Many?
Hundreds, I think.
Hundreds. So yeah, I just love that. Like, we don't know that the Great Goblin did anything. Like, what is the consequence of his relationship with Thorin? We don't really know. He knows his name. He mentions him. He's like, I know who you are, Thorin Oakenshield. But it's the swords. And yeah.
Well, that's the tie. That's the historical tie back in time, is the swords.
Right. More so than that. And he knows that probably the Great Goblin is going to perish here very soon anyway. So why give him any more time than he needs to?
Got like 30 seconds left to live anyway, so.
Just
at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went off, poof, in a tower of blue glowing smoke right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks among all the goblins. And it turns out these sparks aren't just regular sparks; they're actually like killing them, or harming them gravely. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. And they could see in absolute darkness. So is this another Gandalf's offensive gunpowder device? I think so. Like, how do you snuff out all the torches in the room, though? That's an interesting one. Like, maybe there's a great wind that goes with it. Or something.
Well, if he can light pine cones on fire, why wouldn't he be able to also extinguish flames in a cavern?
Yeah, maybe that's right. Maybe he just draws the flame out. And that's quite possible. And then definitely what he does to the massive bonfire in the middle is some kind of pyrotechnic enhanced.
Yeah. That leads up to my favorite phrase, my favorite prose in this entire chapter. And it's kind of reminiscent of an Old English half-line. And if you read it in that way, it kind of sounds like it. It has the alliteration.
Nice.
He writes, the yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls, and curses, shrieking and skriking that followed were beyond description. Those two lines, the yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls, and curses, shrieking and skriking, very much like an Old English half-line. Not precisely, but because he was such a fan of Beowulf, because he was such a fan of Old English.
It's in his DNA.
Yeah, it's in his DNA, and so he brings that in there. And I just love that it even has a little bit of that, since we don't know what word it is, the cacophony of harsh consonants there: yells, yammering, croaking, gibbering, jabbering, growls, howls, curses, shrieking, skriking, which is like a shriek. I love the without, again, just like before when he uses rocks and blocks, without going into precise description, he allows you to create the world of what is happening there inside your own head with these harsh and imprecise but powerful words. And done in such a way that there's a rhythm to it that makes it feel like more than just a description. You know what I mean? Like, yes. There's not a sing-song, but there's a poeticness to this prose that I think
It's almost half
Victor
poetry.
intuited.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, my favorite line. Maybe I'll do that every week. I'm going to bring up my favorite prose from each chapter or each half of a chapter.
That's a good idea.
I might do something. Maybe I'll have Austin create something for that. Anyway, yeah.
Suddenly, a sword flashed in its own light. So here we go. We've introduced the idea that swords can bring their own light, which is one that he's going to return to plenty of times in the next throughout the book. But these swords in specific, and so he Bilbo saw it go right through the Great Goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell dead, and the Goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. This is interesting because, in line with what you said earlier, it's the thing that he focuses on, the sword. It doesn't say suddenly a sword flashed in its own life and Gandalf was there, or Bilbo saw Gandalf there wielding, Glamdring or anything like that. It's just the sword. We don't even hear that Gandalf. It's like the sword's doing this all by itself, and which is funny in a way, because you would have seen. I mean, you see images of the goblins doing things, so clearly you would have seen images of Gandalf or hints of Gandalf. It wouldn't just be the sword by itself, but apparently it is. That's what Tolkien wants us to imagine. And although we understand it's being wielded by someone, and almost definitely Gandalf.
Yeah. Well, if the sword is bright enough from its anger at the orcs, right, it could make it difficult to see Gandalf, because the darkness was broken by this.
Yep.
Casted light from a sword, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can't see anything. There's something happening, and then it goes dark once it kills the Great Goblin again.
Yep. And so off they go, and Gandalf frees them, and then Glamdring, it turns out, was angry. It describes the sword as angry from killing. As they're going through the tunnel, Gandalf took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about. Now it was bright as blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. This sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it beater and hated it worse than biter, if possible. Orcris, too, had been saved, for Gandalf brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. So, again, Tolkien's like all focused on and he has a side note. It's like, yeah, and it cut through the chains, like a sword that can just cut through chains. That's we're talking a different level of thing here. This is not just a sharp sword. This is a sword of tremendous power that can cut through other metal easily. So we have this scene now where they're all running through the dark, being chased, and this is one of the places at which I truly began to hate the Hobbit movies, because it turned this whole scene had a in the book. This entire scene has a feeling of terror and desperation as they're running through dark tunnels, and the goblins are catching up to them in the dark, and they can hear them getting closer and closer, because the goblins, it turns out dwarves are fast under tunnels, but goblins are even faster.
Yeah.
And then at the end, and they have to turn and fight them, and they fight them, and then the goblins put on shoes and run even swifter and silently, and they end up grabbing Bilbo off the back of one of the dwarves. This time it's Dory, and this is like half horror. This is like the fear of being chased in the dark by evil creatures that desire to snatch you. And in the movie, it's this Rube Goldberg of just stupid CGI that's makes Warner Brothers look realistic.
It's slapstick in the movie. It doesn't feel dangerous at all.
It's all slapstick.
That was where honestly the movie completely lost me, was especially that scene of them sliding down the mountain, getting crushed by all the different bridges and pathways that are stacking on top of them, and somehow they all survive it. I'm like, oh well, so it's like Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote here. Nobody really dies. Nobody's in really any danger ever at all, and it just sort of brings down the film. Remember what happens in the Lord of the Rings is that Gandalf dies when he's in the mountain. Here, they all survive a massive fall from an internal mountainside or mountain, chasm, and they're all just fine. Nobody's in any nothing ever happened. And you take away that sense of danger or that sense of terror like you have here, because it's very bright in the movies too. And here it's dark. They turn around, and even the orcs are afraid now of Beater and Biter when they turn around. But then they have to go back into the darkness and try and escape, and then they're ambushed. And like you said, it has that sort of, not horror, but it's scary. It's a dark place for little kids to read.
It's dark and scary. It's the fear of being chased by a monster. It's
a nightmare.
That's gaining on you. It's nightmarish. And I'm not saying it's nightmarish in like the worst possible sense, but it's like a child's nightmare. This is the kind of thing, and the movie transitioned fully into just full blown stupidity at this point.
Yeah,
and that was also where I lost this movie. I was losing it with bird crap Radagast. But
well, yeah, I said completely lost me.
Yep,
I was on a downward spiral there. The swords, though, they do remind me, if anything, like I think Tolkien loved that too, because it reminded me of Anglachel in the Children of Hurin, the sword that actually speaks when he wants to drink the blood. Right, and it's sort of you're like scary. You could imagine here he wanted to go that far, but probably couldn't.
Right, but he describes the sword as having rage and being delighted in killing this great goblin leader. In other words, the sword was actually delighted. The sword could, in a way, distinguish between killing a goblin leader and just a rando goblin, because it killed some of those too, and some of the guards. But the fact that the sword can apparently distinguish such things, and the sword has emotion, I agree with you. It's halfway. Now, he doesn't bring it to the point of speech, and never does with swords. But he is personifying in a way that he's going to personify the ring later on, where it has a will of its own, and it has kind of Tolkien is really good at giving objects their own character, not quite anthropomorphizing, but almost. I mean, this is pretty direct anthropomorphization that is filled with rage and delight. Like that's pretty anthropomorphized, but it doesn't actually do what humans do. It doesn't speak, for example, which it does in Turin in his case. But it's cool. It's Tolkien's at near his height when he's doing this kind of thing. And this is like this scene of terror is kind of like the light version of a similar scene in the dark with Shelob, where it's true horror and the ability to do Tolkien shows forth a master class in horror in Shelob's lair. And this is almost like the precursor to me. It's this terror in the dark. It's a little more childish, but it's still impressive.
It's still impressive. And that's where it ends. They run, and they're ambushed by the orcs. So they turn. Dory runs. Is grabbed from behind.
Yep.
Bilbo falls, and like you said, there
was one funny part. They're running for the first time before they turn and fight. Before Gandalf and Thorin turn and fight with Biter and Beater, Glamping and Orcrist, or Orcrist and Glamping, I should say. And there's this funny part where it says, "Why, oh why did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. "Why, oh why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggered along with the sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and terror.
It's a little bit of a little comic break in the middle of a dangerous scene.
It is a comic break, and it's a modicum of comedic break, which is, I think, appropriate for the general story, and doesn't quite veer into the whole Hobbit movie stupidity.
When does Bilbo switch from Dory to Bomber?
After the fight,
okay.
They stop, they turn and draw swords, and apparently after the fight,
that's when he gets. But he doesn't say it. He just
he doesn't say that he switched people until the end. He says, "Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark." So just a side.
So he starts on Dory. He switches to Bomber. Then they fight, and then the switch to Bomber. When does that happen? I don't think he ever mentions.
No,
it.
It never mentions. Yeah,
okay.
He just tells us.
All right.
No, it does say they took it in turns to carry them on their back. So presumably it was more than just Dory and Bomber.
You're right. Yep.
It was turns.
Okay. Yeah.
So anyway,
he was never carried in the movies, was he?
Nope.
No, he just ran along because he was too
I don't
big
think
to.
so.
Hobbits are supposed to be a little bit smaller than dwarves, I think, still, and they didn't quite get that right in the films.
Yeah, and I'm also I have to admit they might have had him carried at one point, but I don't think so. And if they did, I don't care that much.
You don't want to go back and look to see if
I
it
don't wanna
actually
look.
happened?
Nope.
Yeah, no. I don't even want to research it. Not going to happen. Sorry,
Don't
guys.
even want to watch the internet version.
All right, so there you have it, the end of chapter 4, Overhill and Underhill. Now we get, like we said earlier, we get to the crux of Middle-earth, the point at which we can say everything kind of started falling into place for him and how he was going to start telling the story. So we're going to divide this up at least into 2 parts and then maybe have a third part for Riddles in the Dark, where we talk about the changes that he made and what the original was in 1937 and what the 36, 37, no, I can't remember. When was the Hobbit published? Anyway, what the original was and what he changed it to in the 1967 rewrite. Yeah, 1937 is when it was published. So 30 years later, and
I thought it was
made it work.
Was it 66?
I don't know.
Anyway,
too many years.
Nearly 30 years later. Yep.
Yeah. Which is kind of crazy when you think about it. It had been out 30 years. That's like, I mean, even the Star Wars special editions, it was only 17 years, 6 to 83 to 97, 14 years that they came out. That was different. So,
interesting.
Yeah. 30 years later, that's where I bet he got pretty tired once he started the rewrite. He wouldn't really like going back to it. He's like, oh, I'm not going to take out that comment about the post office. It's fine, guys. Riddles in the Dark is really all I need to worry about. Yeah. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. Chapter 4, Riddles in the Dark. We're going to end with what have I got in my pocket? That's where we're going to end. So we're going to end with the end of the riddle game, essentially, when Bilbo cheats.
That's right. And really to all the freeloaders, we'll miss you. See you next week.